80s was an intriguing era in Bengali cinema that changed it all. It was as if a fast-moving car that was covering new grounds and making new adventures every day suddenly got itself limited to predictable family use. Satyajit Ray was not keeping well and was now limited to dialogue-driven indoor movies. Hrithik Ghatak was no more, and with the change in Bengal political regime, Mrinal Sen's focus moved from political cinema to social dramas, quite naturally, which were all great films, but the varied tonality of Bengali cinema started to fade away. A larger fall came with regard to Bengali mainstream. Bengali mainstream films based on stories, templates which the entire country was following previously came down to lowbrow regressive stuff, bereft of cinematic essence, apart from a handful of exceptions. All combined, the Bengali middle class turned away from the theatres, with their entire attention diverted to Hindi cinema now. And why do we talk about all that in a video tribute to Rituparno Ghosh? Well, the answer is easy. After this slump starting in the 90s, it is Rituparno who worked on the resurrection and brought the Bengali middle class back to the theatres to watch Bengali movies. And much later, in his filmmaking career, he pulled the rug from under the feet of the same middle class with his plunge into queer cinema that merged real and real. But what novelties did Rituparno bring into Bengali cinema? Was he ever successful in reaching beyond the urban middle class? Wasn't he only capable of telling relationship stories? There's so much criticism around the filmmaker that didn't die even after his untimely death. We will try to put our perspective on all that today in this video, our tribute to Rituparno Ghosh on his 58th birthday. This is our interpretation of one of our beloved filmmakers, which might not work for all of you. We would love to have your comments on Rituparno's filmmaking in the comment section. And before we begin, once again asking for your support through likes, shares and subscriptions. Please help us grow to remain motivated to create more content for you. The filmography of Rituparno Ghosh can be broken down into three distinct phases, with an interesting prequel to start with. Heere Rangti, his first feature film, came out in the year 1992. A children's film that reminded of Ray films like Jai Baba Felunath or Agontuk. It was very clear that he wished to carry Ray's legacy, whom he considered to be his mentor. But in the context of Bengali cinema, the most remarkable aspect of Heere Rangti might not be its story or motive. After long, Heere Rangti was a film that invested on the camera, the lightings and shot compositions that were not only concerned about the storytelling. It also brought back the essence of Bengaliness in Bangla cinema, which was missing for long, lost in the excesses of regressive household banter stories. Rituparno got the basics back in the industry in a clinical way, and it started with Heere Rangti. Today, we might be looking for novelties in Rituparno's filmography, but back then, this restoration was of prime importance. It is interesting to note that the fantastical world of Heere Rangti wasn't Rituparno's forte. Unishe April released 2 years later, and with that, started his phase of filmmaking, which we consider to be his strongest. The city of Kolkata was his muse, home and battleground. Calcutta is very important in my upbringing, and it is not Bengal. It is Calcutta, and the distinction between the two is important, Rituparno mentions in one of his interviews. In Calcutta, you see everything that a Bengali has, in a slightly more refined and filtered form, he continued. This perhaps is a key consideration in appreciating Rituparno's cinema that focused on middle-class constituency. His films, mostly shot indoors, relying heavily on dialogue, body languages and scores, reflecting the neo-middle class of the city, politics of the home, and the silent struggles of individuals within the domestic space. In real, these are the same people who also happen to be his primary audience, or maybe his only audience. And while one cannot boast of Ghosh's variety of subject matter, what he achieved in this focus is to be discussed and realized.
প্রসন্ন, তাড়াতাড়ি করে কলা পাতাগুলো দাও প্রসন্ন। নিচে ওরা বসে আছে।
এই কলা গাছ তো দেওয়া যাবে না দিদি।
কেন?
ভেলা তৈরি হবে যে, সাপে কাটা মরা তো, কলার ভেলায় ভাটিয়ে দিতে হবে।
Rituparno's films questioned the power of women in our patriarchal society and brought out subjects that were rarely discussed in the open. Starting with Unishe April and later in Titli, Rituparno took up the extremely sensitive theme of demythologizing the mother. In both films, Ghosh articulates the complexities of motherhood through the relative unexplored relationship between mothers and daughters. Thus, in a double move, on one hand Rituparno decouples the iconic social status of motherhood from the mother characters in both the films. And on the other hand, they open up the politics of the domestic sphere and see how emotional and intricate relationships between women are as they struggle to find their domestic identities. Motherhood and marriage were not necessarily a natural progression for her, says Aparna Sen's Sarojini in Unishe April. And in Titli, it's Aparna Sen again as Urmila representing a mother who is not isolated from passion as we are habituated to see in reel or real. Titli beautifully juxtaposes Urmila's life as a mother with her rather flirtatious conversations with Rohit. Along with Titli, we see her sing and recite poetry as if quoting like a young girl. In one of the scenes, Urmila's shawl slips off to reveal her night dress, and we find Titli shocked as if in a sudden discovery of a mother's venereal body. Similarly, in Utshab, Parul Sanjoy realizes and accepts his mother's past relationship against societal boundaries and stands by her. Uniting the desire and motherhood in the same sequence as this one, Rituparno has questioned the maiden identity of the all-giving mother and her ideal values and norms time and again. The yearning of the spinster in Badiwali is an extension of the same resistance to norms. The film narrates various ways in which female agency is rooted through male exploitation and patriarchy. By placing Bonolata both within the feudal space as well as within the societal conventions of female image, the film traces the transition from tradition to modernity and portrays Rituparno's reaction against India's prevailing social and cultural norms. Badiwali, that we consider Rituparno's finest film, is also one of the most sensual Indian films ever. And yet, there's not much graphical giving away of sexuality. This mirrors Rituparno's cinema itself, where the characters constantly negotiate between their social image and conflicting desires, trying to find a way in between. Rather than striving for an alternative representation through complete rejection of the societal structures, Rituparno's characters try to operate within the structure that constrained them, symbolizing and upholding social values and strategically undermining them at the same time. In Dohun, the aging grandmother remembers how her husband snubbed her from getting higher education so that she doesn't come at par with him in academics. And yet, she loved the same husband more than anyone else in the world. We watch Jhinuk, who spontaneously came forward to help Romita against her molesters, to be in dilemma to continue her relationship with her loving fiancé when he asks her not to appear in court. And while the courageous Jhinuk might be compromising here, the always compromising Romita walks out of the security of marital life to explore life beyond societal norms and boundaries. Rituparno's cinema was not for the ambitious future, but for the always compromising present, which might lead to that future someday. His characters, who keep on negotiating in the present, represent the provocative fire that might bring on the societal shift someday. And his cinema captures the struggles of this transition. No wonder Rituparno appealed to the neo-middle class, a class itself carrying a sense of incompleteness, of something in the process of obscurity, like the end credits in Chokhirwali that says that even if the Bengal partition could be stopped in the present day, it eventually happened 42 years later in spite of all opposition. The negotiations and transitions that underline this first phase of Rituparno's work is also a transition for him in real to open up to his queer identity few years later. This first phase, although did not have any queer story to say, it had sensibilities in its protagonists that rang true to any gay man or woman. Bonalota or Binodini were characters of forbidden desire. The reporter Mollika in Shubho Muhurot admits of being attracted to two men and wonders why she could not have them both. Joy and Shampa, cousins by relation, express and suppress a forbidden tension across the film Utshab. If you look closely at the body of work of his female protagonists, you realize how Rituparno was living through his leading ladies, completely immersed in their inner chambers. Rohini in Ashok can very well be considered a predecessor to Rudro in Chitrangada. Both victims of stardom, losing their lovers to much younger competitors that lead them to doubts and disbelief. And then once again, in a double move, the same film invests up on a father-daughter relationship built around the same domestic sphere. In an amazing sequence, expressing the vulnerabilities of the celebrated, we see the superstar daughter searching for her elderly father's support when there's load shedding at home. Such vulnerabilities, dilemmas, negotiations, and continual resistance formed a unique female gaze coming across from Rituparno's cinema. That was hardly there in Bengali cinema before, or for that matter, in Indian cinema such consistently. Take that for novelty, will you? Chokhirwali in 2003 might be considered as the beginning of Rituparno's second phase. Series of films marked by obsession around casting Bollywood actors and grandeur that overshadowed his themes. The films in this phase feel somewhat redundant. The female gaze was still around, but not organic enough as his earlier films. And most of the underlying themes were already explored. Arjun Rampal Siddharth in The Last Layer might not be very different from Chiranjeev's Dipankar in Badiwali. And the caricaturist on-the-face sexuality of Antur Mahal was no match to the subtle yet persuasive portrayal of Badiwali. The Bollywood stars were never comfortable with his universe. That clearly affected the films. However, the one film that stands out in this phase of Rituparno's work is Subcharitra Kalpanik, where the director was at his experimental best, blending form and content in poetic beauty. And poetry in literal sense too, as Subcharitra Kalpanik stands out to be one of the best films around poetry, rhythms of rhyming, and how prosaic real-life conflicts with poetry of imagination, as the film oscillates between real and surreal. The film also ponders upon the longevity of a creative soul, and how it might be more amicable to coexist with a totally different human being after his or her death, as might have happened with Rituparno himself. And that brings us to Rituparno's most discussed and often misunderstood third phase of filmography, the queer trilogy, comprising of Arekti Premer Golpo, directed by Kaushik Ganguly, Memories of March, directed by Sanjay Nag, and Chitrangada, directed by Rituparno himself. As we mentioned before, we do not consider this to be a phase where Rituparno challenged heteronormative structures for the first time. Rather, it was a phase where the man came out from behind the shadows in real life that mirrored his cinema as well. Rituparno was Bengal's cultural icon by then, and starting from his appearance to apparels as anchor in talk shows or editor of film magazines, he was now out to challenge the outlook of the same middle class whom he brought back to the theatres. He was thus assimilating and normalizing the queer aesthetic in the consciousness of the Bengali neo-middle class, where he himself belonged to and understood the best. Both Arekti Premer Golpo and Chitrangada is based on the popular structure of a hetero love triangle, only to have a bisexual man, a woman, and another man in the role of the quintessential other woman. Obhiroop in Arekti Premer Golpo or Rudro in Chitrangada cross-dresses, wears not so subtle makeup, while Ornob in Memories of March is much subdued, thus expressing multiple shades of queer identity. Mythical subtexts are used in all the three films to deploy assimilation and challenging heteropatriarchal discourse. Arekti Premer Golpo invested on the androgynous figure of Lord Chaitanya. Memories of March refers to the Radha Krishna myth, while Chitrangada appropriates an episode from Mahabharata celebrated through the Tagore text. And yet we see a progression in this trilogy. The origin of the desire of Rudro's sex change in Chitrangada might be lying in Arekti Premer Golpo, where Obhiroop loses Boshu to his pregnant wife. But by the end of the film, Rudro is ready to abandon the vaginal reconstruction surgery and remove his breast implants. It is as if Rituparno in Real and Real, culminating into the acknowledgement of the wishful heart, irrespective of the body it belongs to. Like the female gaze of his first phase of work while still negotiating with the male body, or like his female embodiment in Chitrangada, hallucinating a male alter ego, as in Anjan Dotto's character. Why is a building called a building even when it is complete? Rudro receives the message from the mysterious sender. It underscores the idea of continuity that is applicable to any entity in the world, all of which are in a process of becoming. Answers his alter ego. That is what happened with Rituparno, his characters, his compromises, and his cinema. And after the untimely departure of his body 8 years ago, the questioning heart still remains among us through his cinema, continuously assimilating us into the ever-going process of becoming the man of heart.